They said she left the party smiling, a glass of champagne trembling in her hand, her pearls catching the light as she vanished down the marble corridor of Newport's grandest mansion. The orchestra never stopped playing. No one noticed the way her laughter cut off mid-note, the way her shadow seemed to dissolve as though swallowed by the walls themselves. Her name has been erased from polite society for over a century. Newspapers ran her face for a few weeks, then withdrew it without explanation. Guests who danced with her that night later denied she was ever there. Even the mansion's guest book, preserved in the archives, carries a single dark stroke of ink where her name should be, as if censored by some unseen hand. But inside a folder marked only Case 1921 Restricted, a different record survives: the story of the disgraced socialite who disappeared in Newport, and the strange chain of events that followed her absence. And if the papers are correct, it was not she who vanished from the world, but the world that quietly closed its doors on her. The Gilded Age had already collapsed under the weight of its own glitter by the time she arrived in Newport. The great families still threw their parties, still lined their staircases with silk gowns and tuxedos, but something in the air was different. Old money sensed its reign slipping away. New wealth, loud, industrial, and unrefined, was buying its way into ballrooms once reserved for names written in bloodlines. Newport, the seaside jewel of Rhode Island, had become a theater of masks. Behind every chandelier, scandal simmered. Behind every photograph, something had been cut away. She was called Evelyn Whitford. 24 years old, born in Philadelphia, the daughter of a banker who made his fortune in railroads. Not aristocracy, but wealthy enough to purchase entry into their games. Her beauty was noted, but in tones more clinical than admiring. In one preserved letter, a hostess described her as the kind of face one does not forget, though one may wish to. Another wrote, her eyes seemed to move a fraction slower than her head, as if the body turned before the mind consented. And yet she was invited everywhere. Because Evelyn had something rarer than charm, she had secrets. Her father's investments were tangled in quiet lawsuits, rumors of bribery and missing funds. Servants whispered that he spent long nights in his study, tearing pages from ledgers and burning them in the fireplace. Evelyn inherited not just his fortune, but the weight of that silence. In photographs from the summer of 1921, she appears on the edge of group portraits, never at the center, never quite touching those around her. Always with one hand curled, as if concealing something small and sharp in her palm. Her entrance into Newport society was not gentle. At her very first ball, she arrived an hour late, claiming she had mistaken the address. But the housekeeper, interviewed years later, swore she found Evelyn alone in the library hours before the guests arrived, standing motionless before a locked cabinet of family letters. When questioned, Evelyn laughed it off. But the lady of the house told her husband that evening, the girl does not look at people, she looks through them as though searching for something we do not know we've lost. Her disappearance came on August 12, 1921, during the so-called Harvest Ball at the Kingsley estate. It was the largest event of the summer: 3 orchestras, fountains of champagne, a garden lit by hundreds of paper lanterns. The Kingsleys were old money, and this ball was meant as a final declaration of dominance over the encroaching tide of new wealth. Evelyn was seen on the veranda with a glass in hand, speaking to a man no one could later identify. Some guests recalled he wore a uniform, others insisted it was merely a dark dinner jacket. But all agreed on one detail: his face, when described, never matched between witnesses. Some saw a young officer with pale eyes. Others swore he was older, with thinning hair and a cruel smile. The last sighting placed her near the upper corridor where the family portraits hung. A maid claimed she saw Evelyn lingering before a painting of the Kingsley matriarch, running her gloved finger across the frame as though tracing words invisible to others. Minutes later, her laughter echoed down the hall, cut short, like a string snapped in silence. She was never seen again. The official explanation was polite. Miss Whitford departed unexpectedly, due to a family emergency. But in the weeks that followed, whispers drowned the music of Newport society. Servants said her room at the boarding house remained untouched, her clothes still neatly folded, her jewelry box unopened. Her father refused interviews, then fled to Europe under the pretense of business. No letters, no telegrams, no trace. And yet, fragments of the night survive. In the Newport Historical Society archives, a sealed envelope rests among decayed programs and menus from that summer. Inside is a single scrap of paper, the ink smudged and the edges singed. It reads, "He asked what I had promised. I told him the door was never mine to close. He said the silence would keep me." No signature. But the handwriting, matched to Evelyn's letters, leaves little doubt. What did she mean by the silence? In psychological terms, silence is rarely neutral. It is either a sanctuary or a weapon. Families of that era thrived on it. Scandals buried, affairs unspoken, debts erased with careful omissions. But silence also devours memory. It reshapes truth. Consider this. Every guest interviewed about Evelyn's final night contradicted the others. One swore she wore emerald silk. Another insisted it was ivory lace. Some said she seemed cheerful, others claimed she was pale and trembling. When accounts diverge this sharply, psychologists point to suggestion, to the way the mind edits itself when confronted with what it cannot reconcile. Witnesses forget what unsettles them, replacing it with something safer. But here, the divergence feels orchestrated, as if memory itself had been tampered with. And yet, there are limits to silence. Secrets leave residue. Shadows at the edges of photographs, initials carved in drawers, rumors passed down through servants who saw more than they were meant to. Newport still holds those residues. Among the sealed police records, released only in fragments decades later, there is a curious note. Unusual stain discovered on upper corridor wall, 3 feet above floor, 7 inches across. Sample destroyed before analysis. Destroyed. Not misplaced, not lost, destroyed. What? A private detective hired by Evelyn's relatives later wrote that the wall itself appeared to ripple under lamplight, as though moisture were trapped beneath the plaster. But when he touched it, the surface was dry, and the sound echoed differently than the rest of the corridor. Hollow like a cavity. When he reported this to the Kingsleys, his employment ended that same night. His journals, recovered from an estate sale in the 1960s, end mid-sentence. Door behind the wall, not bricked but sealed. The page following is torn out. So where did Evelyn Whitford go? Did she walk willingly into silence? Was she erased by the powerful family she unsettled? Or was there, hidden within the mansions of Newport, something older than money, something that required her absence as payment? Her story does not vanish with her. Because weeks after her disappearance, the people closest to her began to unravel. One hostess claimed Evelyn's name began to appear in her invitations, written in unfamiliar handwriting, though she never added it. Servants complained of hearing footsteps outside guest rooms long after the lights had gone out. And in a private letter, preserved in the Kingsley papers, the matriarch herself wrote, "She is gone, yet I feel her at my shoulder. The silence does not soothe me, it presses. If this is the cost of erasure, it is too high." What did she mean by the cost? By late autumn, newspapers quietly ceased mentioning Evelyn Whitford altogether. When asked, society figures claimed never to have known her. Invitations bearing her name were dismissed as clerical errors. It was as though she had been cut from Newport's memory with surgical precision. But memory resists erasure. In the 1930s, during renovations of the Kingsley estate, workers discovered a pair of women's shoes bricked into the wall behind the upper corridor. They were not decayed, but preserved as if time had paused around them. Inside one shoe was a folded scrap of paper. It read, "The silence watches." No explanation. No signature. Only those 3 words. If you've stayed with me this far, pause for a moment. Think about the phrase Evelyn wrote before she vanished: "The silence would keep me." And the one found years later: "The silence watches." Do they describe the same presence? Or are they warnings from opposite sides of some threshold? I want you to leave your mark here just as Evelyn did. Comment the phrase "the silence watches" below, so others who reach this point will know you've seen what most will never hear. And if you wish to keep descending with us, subscribe not as a follower, but as a member of our society of truth seekers. Because the file does not end here. In fact, what comes next is far more unsettling. For Evelyn Whitford's story did not stop with her absence. It infected Newport itself. At first, the changes were subtle. Servants whispered of doors locking from the inside when rooms were empty. Mirrors seemed to cloud over when certain names were spoken. Guests felt watched in the hallways as if portraits' eyes shifted when no one was looking. But by 1922, those who had been closest to Evelyn began to suffer in public. One woman, a hostess who had introduced Evelyn at her first Newport ball, was found sleepwalking along the cliffs. She claimed she heard Evelyn calling her name, though no one else heard it. Another man, an officer rumored to have courted her, resigned his post abruptly, writing only, "I promised her the door would remain shut. I have failed." Shut against what? No records explain. But every surviving fragment circles back to the same words: silence, doors, promises. The most chilling detail emerges from a diary kept by a maid in the Kingsley house, never intended for public eyes. August 18, 1921, Miss Whitford not gone. Saw her in corridor again. Mouth open but no sound. Eyes like glass. She turned to wall and stepped inside. I will not speak this aloud. The entry was never followed up. The maid resigned weeks later, her wages paid in full and her name struck from staff records. Was she delusional? Exhausted? Or did she glimpse what others refused to see, that Evelyn had not vanished outward but inward, into the very architecture that once hosted her? And this is where the story begins to fracture between history and something far older. Because among the oldest families of Newport, whispered legends existed long before Evelyn arrived. Stories of houses that were more than houses. Rooms that swallowed secrets. Corridors that remembered too much. One such tale, written in an 1870s family Bible, warns, "Do not speak your bargains where the plaster listens. The silence repeats what we give it." Plaster listens. Silence repeats. It sounds like superstition, a servant's tale meant to keep children from wandering into unfinished wings. But when layered against Evelyn's last words, it feels less like folklore, and more like instruction. Instruction for a ritual. Here the archive grows thinner, as though pages themselves were afraid to survive. But one interview, conducted decades later with a Kingsley descendant, offers a chilling clue. When asked about Evelyn, the woman grew pale and whispered. She wanted entry. She was told the door would open only to one who carried both guilt and hunger. And she carried both. Entry to what? No one knows. The tape of the interview ends with the sound of the woman sobbing, begging not to continue. But if this is true, then Evelyn's disappearance was not an accident. It was a transaction. And silence was the price. What is silence truly when used as currency? Psychologically, silence is absence with weight. The absence of voice, the absence of witness. It is the perfect prison. No walls, no locks, only the erasure of recognition. You are not seen, not remembered, not even denied. Evelyn Whitford may have chosen it. Or she may have been chosen by it. But the residue of her choice lingers. Even today, visitors to the ruins of Newport's old mansions report hearing faint laughter in the corridors, a sound cut short as though swallowed mid-breath. Some claim to feel walls pulse faintly as if breathing. A few swear they've seen a woman in outdated silk standing at the end of the hall, until they blink and she is gone. All of them describe one detail the same. She never looks at them. She looks through. And perhaps that is why her story was buried. Because if Evelyn Whitford did not simply vanish, If she stepped into silence itself, then she did not go alone. She left a door open behind her. And doors, once open, rarely close without cost. The mansion never recovered. By 1923, the Kingsley estate had lost its luster. The family sold off portraits, closed their gardens, and withdrew from public life. Neighbors claimed the grand house looked ill, as though the stone itself had soured. Guests stopped visiting, servants quit suddenly, and society found other halls to haunt. Yet the silence did not remain locked within the Kingsley walls. It bled outward into Newport itself. Letters preserved in the archives describe a strange unease among the elite. A visiting minister noted that dinner parties seemed quieter, as if every conversation risked crossing some invisible threshold. A French governess employed by another family wrote in her journal that her pupils began playing a game called the listening wall, where they stood still and pressed their ears to the plaster, claiming to hear footsteps and muffled weeping on the other side. When she scolded them, they laughed and said, "It's just Miss Evelyn." Children invent names. But what unsettled her was not that they used Evelyn's, it was that they said it as if they already knew her. In one particularly unsettling report, a cook recalled seeing her employer's daughter, barely 8 years old, standing in the empty corridor of their summer home, whispering into the wall. When asked what she was doing, the child replied, "She says she's not gone. She says the silence is bigger now." The cook, shaken, left her post that same week. What unsettles historians and psychologists alike is not just the persistence of Evelyn's memory in these anecdotes, but the way it metastasized. Those who denied knowing her often contradicted themselves in private moments. A banker who claimed never to have heard her name was discovered to have a monogrammed handkerchief bearing her initials. A hostess swore Evelyn was a fiction invented by gossip, yet fainted when she received a blank envelope containing only a pressed orchid, the same flower Evelyn had worn at her final ball. Memory erodes, but it does not plant tokens in locked drawers. Someone, or something, wanted her remembered in the strangest possible way, not in clarity but in fragments that gnawed at certainty. This is the psychology of haunting. Not a specter rattling chains, but a pressure on the mind, forcing those around it to doubt what they once trusted. And it worked. By the mid-1920s, Newport society treated Evelyn's name as poison. Speaking it aloud was said to invite the listening silence. She was neither dead nor alive in memory. She was a gap, a door ajar, an unfinished sentence. And unfinished sentences demand completion. In 1927, a construction foreman tasked with repairing the Kingsley Ballroom collapsed on the job. His crew reported that he suddenly stopped mid-stride, removed his gloves, and placed his hands flat against the wall. He pressed his ear to the plaster, began speaking in low tones, then screamed as though burned. By the time the men dragged him away, his hands bore pale impressions like frostbite, though the wall itself was warm to the touch. The foreman never returned. His journal, discovered later, contained a single repeated phrase, "Not gone, not gone, not gone," written across 15 pages. Psychologists might call this hysteria, an episode triggered by exhaustion, stress, or suggestion. Yet suggestion cannot account for the marks left on his skin, nor the fact that several of his crew abandoned their pay and fled the estate entirely, refusing to describe what they had seen. The silence was no longer content with whispers and half-memories. It had begun to mark bodies. And then came the newspaper article that never officially existed. In July of 1928, the Newport Herald reportedly printed a brief column about the mystery of the vanished heiress. A surviving clipping, browned and brittle, mentions Evelyn by name and claims her disappearance had sparked renewed investigation. Yet every archived edition from that summer shows no such column. Page numbers skipped strangely, as if something had been excised before microfilming. A librarian who handled the collection in the 1960s wrote a note on the file. Herald, July 14, 28, torn deliberately. Missing Evelyn. Her handwriting is shaky, as though even writing the name unsettled her. Why would a local paper dare to mention Evelyn after nearly a decade of silence, only to retract it so completely that even the physical page was cut away? The answer may lie in a rumor passed down by an aging editor decades later. He claimed that the article was withdrawn at the insistence of a gentleman who was not there. When pressed, he refused to explain, repeating only, "He was not there, but he was seen." His description matches that of the man Evelyn was last seen speaking with at the Kingsley ball, a figure whose face no two witnesses could agree upon. What if he had not been a man at all, but a mask worn by silence itself? The 1930s brought new tragedy. The Kingsley family abandoned their estate entirely, citing financial decline. But those who knew them whispered a darker truth, that the matriarch had grown increasingly erratic, claiming Evelyn came to her bedside at night, lips moving without sound. Servants reported finding her sitting upright, staring at the wall, whispering the phrase, "The door is still open." When her health collapsed, her final words, recorded by a nurse, were chilling, "Close it, for God's sake, close it before she learns to bring others." Was Evelyn alone in whatever silence had claimed her? Or had she become a vessel for something that needed more than one presence, more than one offering? During renovations in 1934, workmen discovered a series of thin cavities inside the walls of the Kingsley mansion. They were not structural nor architectural, narrow, coffin-like spaces sealed behind plaster. Within one they found scraps of fabric, delicate lace matching early 1920s fashion. In another, a pair of eyeglasses. No bodies, no bones, only the impressions of absence, belongings without owners. The foreman ordered the walls resealed. No official record was filed, but one worker smuggled out a fragment of fabric, later identified by comparison to surviving photographs of Evelyn's gowns. The implication is clear and deeply unsettling. The walls had not merely held silence. They had held people. At this point, any rational explanation falters. Were these cavities evidence of old construction practices? Secret passages? Or were they, as whispered among the workers, rooms for the kept, spaces where the silence stored what it had claimed? If so, Evelyn may not have disappeared into myth. She may have been the first of many. But by then her story had already twisted into legend. Newport locals spoke of the vanished lady, whose laughter echoed in empty ballrooms. Children dared one another to call her name before sealed doors. And society, eager to forget, rewrote its own history. Evelyn was no longer mentioned in guest lists, diaries, or memoirs. She had been reduced to a ghost story even as the physical evidence of her existence. Shoes, fabric, handwriting, persisted stubbornly. This duality is psychologically devastating. She was both erased and remembered, denied and confirmed. It is a form of gaslighting on a societal scale. When a community insists someone was never there while fragments of their presence remain, the result is a collective fracture in memory. Such fractures are dangerous. They create spaces where silence thrives, feeding on uncertainty. By the 1940s, Newport's gilded mansions had fallen quiet. The Depression, then the war, stripped them of their glamour. Yet the silence remained. Soldiers stationed nearby reported strange dreams of women calling them through walls. One veteran described walking past the abandoned Kingsley estate and feeling a hand brush his sleeve, though the porch was empty. In his journal he wrote, "She has no voice, but she knows my name." Even today, the site of the old Kingsley estate is regarded with unease. The house was demolished in the 1950s, but locals say the land itself hums faintly at night, as if the silence survived the destruction of its shell. Visitors leave offerings, flowers, coins, letters, at the edge of the property, though none admit to doing so openly. It is as if Evelyn's presence lingers, demanding acknowledgement from a world that tried to deny her. And this leads us to the most unsettling possibility of all. What if Evelyn did not disappear but transform? What if the silence that claimed her was not a prison, but an initiation? The fragments of writing, the whispers through walls, the objects preserved without decay, all point to a continuity beyond death, a persistence beyond memory. Evelyn may not have been erased by the silence. She may have become its voice. But if silence has a voice, it is not heard with ears. It is felt in hesitation, in the pause before speaking, in the sudden loss of certainty. It spreads when we doubt what we remember, when we fear the cost of naming what others insist does not exist. Evelyn may have become the first to walk willingly into that threshold. And if the door remained open, then she was not the last. Which brings us here, a century later, speaking of her name again. Are we reopening what the Kingsleys tried to seal? Are we drawing her gaze once more? Or are we simply acknowledging what was never gone to begin with? And perhaps you feel it too, the way the air shifts when her name is spoken aloud, the way the silence after feels weighted. That is not absence. That is presence. Evelyn Whitford has not vanished. She waits, watching, listening for those who dare to speak of her. So I leave you with this. Do you believe Evelyn was a victim, erased by powerful families who sought to bury scandal? Or do you believe she crossed into something older, something that used Newport society as a stage for its own initiation? Leave your theory in the comments below. Because in telling her story, we have already stepped closer to her threshold. And history hides more than it reveals. The silence we speak of is not metaphorical anymore. It has weight in the records, in the testimonies, in the artifacts that somehow escaped the scissors of history. After the demolition of the Kingsley estate in the 1950s, the expectation was that whatever lingered would finally be put to rest. Dust would scatter, bricks would be sold, and the earth would reclaim the foundations. But that is not what happened. The demolition crew left behind reports, scrawled in margins of invoices and scribbled on cigarette cartons, that suggest the silence survived the blow of hammers. One worker wrote that as the wrecking ball struck the ballroom, every window shattered in unison, though the glass was not under strain. Another reported that the radio in their truck, switched off at the time, began to emit a low, droning hum, a sound that grew louder the closer they parked to the ruins. But most haunting of all was a testimony preserved in the notebook of a foreman. He described pulling down a section of corridor wall and finding no studs, no brick, no cavity, just another wall directly behind it, as though the house had folded in on itself. We tore walls, he wrote, but the walls replaced themselves. Each space already had a silence waiting to be uncovered. He quit the job after only 3 days. Decades later, new structures were built on that land, first a boarding school, then a retreat center. Both ventures failed within a few years. Students complained of doors opening onto blank walls, and visitors at the retreat center reported dreams that repeated word for word. One man claimed he awoke with dirt beneath his fingernails and no memory of leaving his bed. Their testimonies never made headlines, but in private letters and diaries, the language repeats the same phrases Evelyn left behind: doors, silence, promises. What fascinates psychologists today is the consistency of these reports across generations. Suggestion can explain much, but not uniformity across decades, across people who had no knowledge of the story. Consider how trauma imprints. Families suppress scandal, yet it resurfaces in children's games, in whispered phrases, in compulsions that make no logical sense. It is as though the silence itself is a trauma carried by place, a wound in history that refuses to scar. Newport society tried to excise Evelyn, but the wound bled through their denial. And it reached farther than Newport. In the late 1960s, a folklorist named Harold Atkins interviewed elderly residents of Rhode Island about local legends. In the tapes, crackling, brittle with age, several women mention the girl who went into the wall. One insists that her grandmother attended the Harvest Ball of 1921 and saw Evelyn with her own eyes. Yet when pressed for details, her voice drops to a whisper, "Don't ask me what she became. We all promised not to." That word again, promise. A promise to who or to what? Silence, in this case, feels less like absence and more like a contract. Evelyn promised. The Kingsleys promised. Even strangers a generation later spoke of an oath they barely understood. Contracts written in silence are the most dangerous of all. You cannot renegotiate them, cannot name their terms, because speaking them aloud is to break them. And what happens when a contract with silence is broken? History provides fragments. In the 1970s, a group of students trespassed on the ruins during summer break. They brought a tape recorder, intending to capture evidence of ghosts. The recording survives in private collections, though most who've heard it refuse to listen twice. The students' laughter fills the first minutes, drunken, careless. Then one of them says, "Ask her to come out." Silence follows. A faint tapping begins, measured, deliberate, like fingernails against plaster. Then a woman's voice cuts through, not distant, not ethereal, but pressed close against the microphone. She says only, "You promised." The tape ends in static. The students left town shortly after. 2 transferred schools. 1 disappeared entirely. His family received a blank envelope 6 months later with nothing inside but a pressed orchid. The same orchid Evelyn wore the night she vanished. Police filed it as a cruel prank. But the pattern is too precise to dismiss. Evelyn's absence has become a contagion of memory. Every decade, someone encounters it. In a wall, in a letter, in a dream that feels more like an instruction than a nightmare. And here lies the darkest possibility. Silence is not passive. It is not waiting idly. It recruits. So when we speak her name now, when we reconstruct her life and death with such care, are we simply historians? Or are we participants in the continuation of her promise? The silence thrives when it is acknowledged, when curiosity bends toward it. Perhaps this is why Evelyn has lingered in fragments for a century. Not because she was forgotten, but because we keep remembering her. Because every telling, every whisper, every retelling of her vanishing is fuel. Ask yourself this: who benefits from silence that spreads? Whose hunger is fed by people pressing ears to walls, by men writing the same phrase across 15 pages, by students lured into ruins with recorders? Silence is not a void. It is a mouth. And Evelyn Whitford may have become its tongue. Now, a century later, her story is surfacing again. Not in newspapers, but here in the archive of the forbidden, in voices like ours daring to repeat what was meant to be erased. The silence is watching. And when you close this video, when your room stills and you listen for the hum behind the plaster, you may feel it too, that what vanished at Newport in 1921 was not Evelyn at all. It was the boundary between presence and absence. And that boundary never returned. But history does not end simply because its buildings are gone. The Kingsley mansion was reduced to rubble, yet the silence endured as if the house had only been its instrument. What followed were decades of fragmented encounters, so scattered and faint that archivists often dismissed them as folklore. Yet when these fragments are gathered, their pattern is undeniable. In 1983, a maintenance worker repairing the basement of a Newport library discovered something odd behind a false wall. Inside was a sealed wooden box, warped with age but unbroken. The archivist who opened it found brittle paper, the ink faded, the handwriting almost illegible. At first they believed it to be a servant's account book, but the final pages diverged into personal notes. One entry read, "The girl lingers. She does not eat, she does not sleep, yet she remains. I told her the walls could not hold her forever. She only smiled. She said, 'They do not hold me. They carry me.'" The handwriting has never been matched to any known individual. The pages were quietly catalogued, then locked away. By the late 1980s, the silence had become less of a whispered curse and more of a local absence. Families still told children not to wander the ruins, but the name Evelyn Whitford was rarely spoken aloud. Then, in 1991, the 70th anniversary of her disappearance, a series of anonymous letters were delivered to the Newport Historical Society. Each envelope contained a single object pressed flat: a glove, a photograph with the faces scratched out, a page torn from a guest book. One note, scrawled in graphite on the back of a dance card, read, "She is not history. She is entry." What does that mean, entry? The word suggests initiation, a threshold, a passage rather than an ending. Psychologists might call it dissociative symbolism, the mind attempting to rationalize trauma by turning it into ritual. Yet these objects were real. The dance card dated to 1921. The photograph matched others taken at the Kingsley estate, but every visible face had been scraped into anonymity, leaving only Evelyn's untouched silhouette in the corner. Whoever sent the letters knew details never released to the public. By the early 2000s, interest in Evelyn's disappearance resurfaced among independent researchers. One documentarian attempted to trace her family line, but found that the Whitford records dissolved abruptly after the 1920s. Birth certificates missing, property deeds scrubbed, even passenger lists from ships to Europe where her father was said to have fled, gone. The researcher described the experience as chasing a shadow that knows you're chasing it. His project ended when he received a phone call in the middle of the night. The voice on the other end whispered a single phrase, "The silence keeps you." He abandoned the film. And yet, Evelyn refuses to vanish completely. In 2014, contractors renovating a Newport townhouse uncovered plasterwork that should not have existed. Behind the walls were faint impressions, not of bricks, but of hands pressed outward from the inside. Some prints were small, others large, some overlapping as though generations had leaned against the barrier. When local authorities were called, the plaster was quickly replaced and the workers signed non-disclosure agreements. But one man, unwilling to keep the memory, photographed the impressions before they were sealed again. Those images, blurred but unmistakable, now circulate quietly online. Each handprint seems to echo the same gesture, palms spread as if pushing against a door. And so we return to Evelyn. Did she step into silence willingly as a bargain? Or was she drawn into it, consumed by forces she only pretended to control? The archival fragments suggest she was not a victim alone, but perhaps a participant. The scrap of paper she left that night? He asked what I had promised. I told him the door was never mine to close. This sounds less like the words of a frightened young woman and more like the testimony of someone already bound. If Evelyn had been chosen, then who, or what, did the choosing? Was it the faceless man who spoke with her at the ball, the one whose description never aligned? Or was it the silence itself, that weightless presence pressing from behind the walls, needing only one voice to make itself permanent? And if she became that voice, how many more has she whispered into since? Now the silence circles back to us. By speaking her name, by reconstructing her story, we are reopening the very threshold she crossed. Every mention keeps her from vanishing. Every telling feeds the presence that has never ceased listening. And perhaps that is the true shape of the promise Evelyn made, that she would not vanish alone. Tell me then, what do you believe Evelyn Whitford became? Was she consumed by Newport's attempt to bury scandal, or was she transformed into something far older, something that waits in every wall? Leave your theory below. And remember, what we call silence may not be empty. It may be listening. Some stories resist closure, no matter how much history tries to bury them. In Newport, whispers of Evelyn Whitford still rise like condensation in forgotten corners. Even now, locals claim that when renovations disturb old foundations, strange drafts sweep through sealed rooms, cold, dry winds that carry no source. Workers report tools mislaid, doors that refuse to stay shut, and voices faintly humming melodies from another century. No one admits to knowing the words, but everyone recognizes the sound. They say it is a waltz too slow to dance to. One archivist, who agreed to speak only under anonymity, described receiving a box of documents in 2019 labeled simply, Kingsley Estate/Unverified. Inside were carbon copies of police reports, each page smeared as if once exposed to water. Among the fragments was a line circled in red ink. Subject refused to acknowledge physical world. insisted she was already elsewhere. Though the subject's name was redacted, the date, November 1921, made the implication impossible to ignore. If Evelyn had not vanished at the ball, if she had survived for days or weeks afterward, then her disappearance was not an accident. It was a process. What does it mean to belong elsewhere while still walking among us? Psychology describes states of dissociation where the body continues but the self recedes. In cult studies, subjects are often recorded saying they were already gone before their rituals concluded. Could Evelyn have been rehearsing her own erasure, one gesture at a time? And if so, was the disappearance truly hers to choose, or had Newport's elite simply crafted the perfect stage for her to dissolve upon? Another report in that same box, though torn nearly in half, contained the chilling phrase, "The girl is not missing. She has been admitted." No one knows what institution, if any, those words referred to. But in Newport, the word admitted carries double weight. To admit someone is to confine them. To admit something is also to confess. Perhaps both apply. In 2021, the centennial of Evelyn's disappearance, a private tour of Newport's historic mansions ended in abrupt cancellation when several visitors reported hearing footsteps pacing directly above their heads in a sealed attic. Security staff dismissed it as old beams settling, but multiple guests described the same detail. The footsteps stopped suddenly, then a long pause of silence, then 3 deliberate knocks on the ceiling above them. An archivist later remarked that these knocks were not random. They matched the old rhythm of the waltz Evelyn last danced. If you've made it this far, you are no longer just an observer. You are part of the circle that keeps Evelyn from fading completely. Her silence watches us still. Comment that phrase, "The silence watches," if you feel the weight of her story pressing against you. It marks you as someone who has entered the archive with us, someone the silence now recognizes. And if you wish to keep descending into these forbidden histories, subscribe, not as a follower but as one of us, a society of truth seekers who walk where the official record fears to tread. Tell me in the comments, what do you believe Evelyn Whitford promised? Did she give herself to escape Newport's rot, or was she taken as the price for its survival? The archives will never answer completely. That is their design. And so we close the file, not with resolution, but with recognition. Evelyn's story is unfinished, because silence is never final. It waits. History hides more than it reveals.